All right. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to address all of you again. I hope you've been listening to the videos and that they have been helpful and you've learned a little bit about not only biological systems but also basically how one goes about modeling them. So you're currently you would be watching the videos on basically molecular motors, right? So we've looked at rate equations in biology and how to use rate equations to sort of model dynamical processes going on inside the cell, including, for example, polymerization of cytoskeletal filaments and so on. Currently, hopefully, you'll be looking at these videos, the most recent videos on how to go about modeling molecular motors, and some have been uploaded and some will continue to be uploaded in the next week. And these are, molecular motors are really sort of fascinating machines. Uh, these are non-equilibrium machines, which are very robust, so which are individually, in some sense, stochastic objects, right? That each motor is binding and unbinding stochastically. So with some rate, it gets bound onto the cytoskeletal filaments, and with some rates, it comes off. So there's nothing deterministic about it. But on the other hand, this system of molecular motors as a whole is extremely robust in that it performs the function, it delivers whatever it needs to deliver, where it needs to deliver it, at the time that it needs to deliver it, right? So these are um, so at an individual level, these are stochastic, but at a collective level, these are very robust phenomena. So it's extremely fascinating, and hopefully, you also find it fascinating as well. Right. So once we finish with this segment on motors, there'll be one more. Um, there will be one more sort of section which is to do with pattern formation in biology, and again, that is something that I personally find very fascinating. In that, for example, if you think about embryos, right? All life starts with a single cell uh, when a sperm fertilizes an egg, and starting from the single cell, which is very uniform mixture of whatever proteins and so on, somehow there are physical and chemical processes that go on that that give rise to some sort of patterning, right? And then as this embryo develops from a single cell, it divides into multiple cells and so on. Ultimately, you have a full adult organism, like say a human being or whatever, some other organism that you're thinking of. And we have this precise patterning. We have two hands and two legs, and all of our organs are in the correct places and so on. And all of this happens starting from this very single embryo where everything is very uniform and very homogeneously mixed. So if one thinks about it, especially so, of course, as the as a single cell divides into multiple cells, it becomes the processes that are involved become increasingly complicated. But even at a very simple level, at this very single cell or a few cell level, you can think about what sort of patterns that develop early on. So this is just one example of pattern formation that I'm giving. There are patterns in multiple other contexts in biology. But so in this context, you could think about, for example, um, what are the physical processes that are necessary and what are the chemical processes that are necessary in order to give rise to these very early patterns in this unicellular or this few cells organism that can later on set so that can sort of set in motion all of these changes that are required for the patterning of this adult organism, right? And this is a fascinating topic, and uh, in some sense, the earliest sort of theoretical approaches were in this sort of direction as to what are generic conditions in which interacting chemical species can give rise to patterns. So these were first sort of thought of by the legendary British scientist Alan Turing, and he sort of wrote down a couple of differential equations, and he analyzed these differential equations sort of mimic chemical processes that are going on, and then these chemicals can talk to each other. So there's some sort of interaction between these chemicals. And he asked, what is the sort of minimal set of rules that will allow me? So if I started from an uniform mixture of these chemicals, what sort of interaction rules, what are the sort of minimal interaction rules that will allow me to sort of develop certain robust patterns in this system? And that's sort of the last module of this course that we look at. So I don't want to go too much into this because the lectures will be uploaded, and if there are any questions at that point, of course I'm happy to address them. Now, what I thought I'll do today, of course, if any of you want me to talk on a specific thing, that's most welcome. But I also thought what I'll do today is maybe I'll just give you a very brief flavor of what sort of other things are possible. Like I said in the beginning of this course, in the first interaction session, and also I think in these early videos, in the first few videos, that biology is an extremely vast and extremely complex topic, right? And even so, thinking about a course like this, I only talk about a very small section. If you think about it, there is lots of topics that I have not spoken about, and but hopefully, this is something that has piqued your interest, and if some particular biological phenomenon that you are interested in, I have not covered it, but you are now comfortable enough with modeling techniques and sort of differential equations and statistical mechanics and equilibrium physics and a little bit of maybe non-equilibrium physics as well in the shape of rate equations and so on, that you can maybe pick up a review paper in the field that you are interested in, and sort of go ahead and read those papers. So what I thought I'll do today is that I'll give a very brief intro to maybe what sort of things have I left out, and what sort of things are possible to study from a theoretical, as a physics person, or as maybe a theoretical or a mathematical student or an engineering student even. What sort of questions are possible to address in biology that I have not covered in this course? And again, that answer to that is still very broad. I've only covered a very minute section, but I'll just give two examples very briefly, nothing in detail. Basically, maybe what I want you to take away is, if some of these things look interesting to you, with the sort of reference slides at the end where I list some sort of basic starting reading material that you can pick up and sort of start to read and to gain a little bit more understanding of these concepts. All right. Before I move on, somebody asks that will the final test have similar questions, and will it be MCQ type? Well, yes, roughly, I think the final test will have questions that are sort of similar to you've been doing in the assignments. And I think there's a sort of weightage in that about a quarter of the questions will be actually directly based on the assignment. So provided you've done the assignments, those should be very easy. Another quarter will be based directly on these slides and the videos. So basically directly on class material. So again, if you just listen to the lectures, and you've done the assignments, you should be set for around 50%, 60% of the marks completely. And the rest will be sort of open questions, but still based on whatever we have discussed, and it'll be fairly simple. So it'll be so not just MCQ. So there, of course, a lot of it is MCQ, but there are also a lot of, for example, numerical answer types. So you calculate something and you put in some number, and you'll get get some numerical answer out. So you have to type in that numerical answer. Again, I think that is also something you've done in the assignment. So it will be a mix of both. It will be some sort of multiple choice or multiple select in some sense. There can be more than one correct option. So those sort of questions, and there will be some sort of numerical questions where you have to maybe do a small calculation and put in some numbers that are given in the question and spit out an answer. All right. So having said that, let me continue. So I thought I'll talk about two very brief things. So let me see. Let me present the window. So one of the things that I have not sort of talked about is this concept of networks. Networks or network theory in itself is, of course, a very well established field in physics, where you have different components all interacting with each other through some sort of a network. For example, one of the most common things to give an example of is the internet itself is a network, right? You have I have a computer here, and you're watching at home at some computer or phone or whatever, and these are connected through links, and these links are like data links in some sense for the case of the internet. And so all these computers form nodes in a network, and then there are connections or links between these nodes, and that dictates how information flows from one node to another. So the internet itself is a network. You could think that, for example, of a network of airplanes and airports in the country. For example, I have an airport in Bombay, and there is another airport in Calcutta and in Delhi, and there are flights which connect these airports. So this air system, the air traffic system in the country, you could represent as a network, right? And of course, so this comes originally from mathematics, and so you can look at these network problems using mathematical tools, and there are various sort of basic results that are known, and you can apply these various results to a biological context to see what you can say about biological networks. And I'll just give a very brief idea about what I mean when I talk about biological networks. So there can be multiple sorts of biological networks. So one of the most common sort of networks that one talks about is protein networks, for example. So when a body produces a protein, these proteins can sort of do multiple things, really. So, for example, you produce a protein in some state. That protein can change its state, for example, through chemical processes like methylation, phosphorylation, acetylation. It can change its conformations and so on. So there can be changes of state of this protein. And then these proteins, depending on what state it is in, can perform regulatory roles. So it can interact with other proteins and affect the functioning of these other proteins. So, there can be transcriptional regulation, there can be chemical responses, there can be dynamical responses, and so on. And then this C protein can go and talk to another protein, and some of these other proteins can come back and talk to this protein A itself. So there is lots of feedback loops going around, different proteins talking with each other. And by talking, I mean that there are chemical reactions that are happening between these proteins and so on, which regulate their structure, which regulate their functioning. So if you think about, so for example, here is a sort of schematic of a regulatory protein network of yeast. And the way you think about this is that all of these red dots, these nodes as such, represents a particular protein. Okay, and some proteins, of course, just sit there, they don't talk to other proteins, but some proteins will interact with other proteins. For example, this protein here, and I hope you can see my cursor over here. For example, this protein over here is talking to this protein, this protein, this protein, this protein, and this protein. So this sort of picture as a whole, and then these colored arrows mean different things, what sort of feedback it is. But anyway, let's not get into that. I just wanted to give you a picture that, for example, for this very simple organism such as yeast, here is what the regulatory structure or the regulatory network looks like, where you have multiple proteins which are talking to multiple other proteins, and these interactions drive the functioning of the yeast cell itself. Okay. So this is one example of a regulatory network, or one example of a network in biology. So you can think of various other networks. So for example, here is an enzymatic network, again in yeast, where you have these multiple enzymes that are, again, have various levels of crosstalk with each other. And if you think about, and so these networks appear, these are extremely complicated, and these are extremely complex networks. And indeed, it is these networks and the interactions between the nodes of this network, whether these are proteins or enzyme, something. So these drive the sort of functioning of the system. So let me not get into this. And like I was saying, so there are multiple. So we know from basic mathematics of network theory that there are multiple ways that one studies these networks. So for example, one of the measures is what is called as a degree. So if you think about a node, and for example, in the context of these protein networks, a node is one particular protein. The degree of a node measures how many links the node has to other nodes. So how many proteins does my protein A talk to? So that's the degree of that protein. And then you can plot sort of distributions of these degrees, and based on these degree distributions. So what do I mean by degree distribution? Node 1 has some degree, let's say K1, so it's connected to K1 number of other nodes. Node 2 has some other degree K2, node 3 has some other degree K3. You could construct a probability distribution of these Ks, so Ki. So if you have multiple nodes or multiple proteins for the protein network, you can construct a probability distribution out of this, and that's called as the degree distribution. Depending on what this degree distribution looks like, you could classify networks into different sorts. So for example, one of the most elementary sort of networks you could think of is a random network, where nodes are connected at random with other nodes. And in that case, the degree distribution looks like a Gaussian. Many real-world networks are what are called as scale-free networks. And in these networks, the degree distribution looks like a power law. Okay. For example, the internet has a scale-free. If you look at the degree distribution of the internet, that's a scale-free network. These terms mean certain things, but I'm not going into them in detail. If there's something that interests you, I'll provide some references at the end that you can just look into. And so, for example, you can calculate these degree distributions for protein networks, right? And you'll see that in many cases for these biological networks, you get what are these degree distributions that are similar to the scale-free networks that I showed in the earlier slide, where this degree comes as a power law. So you get some k to the power of minus gamma. And this gamma can, of course, the value of gamma depends on what network you're looking at. For example, protein binding networks, I think this was data from yeast again, has a gamma of 2.5. So the power, of course, varies, but very often you'll find this sort of scale-free networks with these power law degree distributions reappearing again and again in different contexts. Here's an example of a metabolic network where again you have a degree distribution that follows a power law form. And it is known again from basic network theory how to evolve or how to design networks such that you get these sort of power laws, degree distributions that are power laws. And again, you can look these up if you're interested. Let me not talk about these. And again, so these links are not all uniform. Like, in this first picture of the yeast network that I showed, just two proteins can be connected to one another, but the nature of connection might differ. For example, one protein can be activating another protein, and that would be one sort of link. Another protein might be repressing a different protein, and that would be a different sort of link. So these links may or may not all be uniform, and that brings in another level of complexity into this networks. And yeah, so you can think, so let me not go into these. There are multiple examples of networks that are possible. Let me just end with one more example. This is something maybe you might, we talked about a little in this course towards the middle when I was talking about this chromosome organization. So if you remember, we talked about these high C experiments, which sort of measures how often two parts of your chromosomes, of your genome basically, are in contact with one another. And that gave us these sort of matrices, these high C matrices, where the intensity of the color sort of denotes how often two base pairs or two regions of the chromosome or chromatin are in contact with one another. Okay, and so, for example, you can think of this in a network sort of a language. So, for if I have a piece of string, for example, let's say I have this mask. So here is here is my chromosome, and there is one base pair here and another base pair here. And if I do these high C experiments and I find that these base pairs are always very close to one another, so this is actually nice. So I say that over here these two base pairs are very close to one another. You can think that there is a sort of link in this network language. You can think that there is a sort of link between this base pair and this base pair, right? So you can think of these chromosomal conformations in terms of a network language, and you can convert this high C probability matrix into a network topology, for example, and do the sort of basic network analysis on these different chromosomes. So, for example, there's just some basic analysis of human chromosomes. So, for example, chromosome 14 has some number of nodes, and here nodes denote regions of the genome with some certain fixed width. I think this was done with some 50 kilobase. So each node represents a 50 kilobase segment. It could be long, but I think it was 50 kilobase. And then you could sort of plot, again, similar things like degree distributions of these nodes. And it turns out that in this case, unlike in the protein networks, these degree distributions are actually no longer power law. They form some sort of, not really Gaussian, but some sort of a peaked distribution. So these are skewed distributions and so on. So these are somewhat different from these chromosomal networks, are somewhat different from the protein networks that I was showing a couple of slides ago. Anyway, so I don't want to get into a lot of details, but so if you're interested in so this is a very broad field in itself. People have worked for their whole lives on this sort of network approaches to biology. And if you are interested, here's a sort of very starting sort of references, I would say. So this paper by Parabasi and Altwey in Nature Reviews Genetics, it talks about network biology, so basically this sort of a topic, and how to understand the cell's functional organization in terms of these networks. If you're interested in networks from a physics point of view, so like the basic physics or the basic mathematics of networks, not necessarily in a biological context, but in general, this paper in Reviews of Modern Physics is sort of the go-to guide. It's very accessibly written, so it's you can just read it and sort of understand at least at a certain level what is being said. Statistical mechanics of complex networks. So again, if you're interested, I would encourage you to read this paper. And then, these are also additional readings, this chapter in Schneppen's book, and this article of Robustness as an Evolutionary Principle by, again, Bernhold and Schneppen. And of course, once you read these papers, you'll find hundreds of other links in these papers themselves that go into a lot more detail about this concept of networks in biological systems. All right. So let me see. That's one thing that I just wanted to talk about. Maybe I'll just take 5 minutes to show you one more thing. Another topic, which again I'm not going to cover in this course, but it's something that I've seen people are interested in. So again, you can, if you are interested in that, you can again just note down the references and just read up a little bit more on that. So. So this is to do with evolution and evolutionary dynamics, and how to sort of think about evolution using using the sort of the mathematical toolboxes that we learned in this course. Okay, how to describe evolutionary dynamics. So here's a very nice quote actually by Stephen Jay Gould, who says that if you think about humans, we have around 30,000 to 40,000 genes, and therefore and if you look at the number of genes in the tiny roundworm, that is about double that. Okay, so there originally, in the early days, there was this idea that the higher up you go in the evolutionary scale, in some sense, the number of there is an increasing complexity in the number of genes. So the number of genes increases, and that's what leads to these complex organisms, such as human beings. However, that is, that's, we no longer think that, and as Gould says, that the key to complexity is not only more genes, but more combinations and interactions. So how do these genes interact with each other? How are they being expressed? How are they being repressed? And it's not enough to understand each gene as an individual component, but you need to understand this whole system and the evolution of this whole system, including these interactions as a whole, in order to gain a holistic understanding. Okay. So it's something nice. Anyway, so if you think about, let's say, Darwinian evolution, all of us are sort of connected at some level along this evolutionary tree. This is a nice diagram that I've from this reference Hinchcliffe. Starting from eukaryotes at the base, and different things, sort of different families diverge at different points, and at the end, you have all of these different sort of classes of organisms of life, basically. And there are various interesting questions that people try to answer. For example, if you think that how did life originate? What was the chemical environment that was necessary for these very early nucleotides, DNA, RNA, to sort of emerge spontaneously? So, in some sense, what are the biochemical pathways through which genetic and metabolic information could spontaneously arise? So that's a sort of chemistry point of view. These are sort of chemistry questions, at what sort of biochemical networks are necessary. You could also ask questions of evolution from a more physicsy perspective, and so, for example, you could think about generalized description of these evolutionary processes by considering all allowed static and dynamic symmetries, and see how these interactions give rise to collective states. How new states emerge through these interactions themselves. Okay. So, for example, if one thinks of a physics question as opposed to a chemistry question, you could ask that: how is it that matter self-organizes into hierarchies that are capable of generating feedback loops that connect multiple levels of organization and are evolvable? So these have this property that you can evolve these sort of networks and loops at multiple levels. Right. So let me skip some of this. So there are different kinds of theoretical models that are possible. Um, in general, so let me just talk about one of them. For example, you could think about populations with some. So for example, I think about interacting populations, each with some sort of genotype. Let's say some genome alpha, and then you say that these populations, individuals in these populations are born and they die, and these populations sort of interact with one another. Uh, and by interaction in this case, for example, if you're looking at population level dynamics, these would be mutations. So for example, if population 1 differs from population 2 through some sort of genetic mutation, then you could convert from one population to another through this mutation, some mutation, through this corresponding mutation, and the corresponding rate is given by this mutation rate m alpha beta. So you could think of dynamical models in the spirit that how do populations convert from one to another, and the evolution of these populations are often thought of in terms of fitness landscape. So a population sort of evolves with time, and it sort of settles down when it meets, let's say, a sort of local, if I think in terms of I'm talking in a very hand waving sense. These can be formalized, of course, but yeah, so it cannot be formalized until you know a little bit more of these topics in depth. So I'm not going into the details, but you can think of these as these populations move. You can think that they're moving in some sort of a potential landscape, and these can settle down into the minimas of this potential landscape, which then represent stable states of these populations. So why do some sort of mutations get fixed in um, get fixed? So what sort of stabilizes a population, and these are determined by these sort of fitness landscapes. And these fitness landscapes can be static, they can be dynamic. Let me not get into that. Again, so there are multiple things. Sorry, let me view. Yeah, so let me not get into the details, but if you're interested in this sort of topic, again, that if you're interested in thinking about how to think about evolution from a mathematical or from a physical point of view, there is this very nice there's very nice papers. So this is I really like this paper. It's basically a story, so there's not a lot of complicated maths. So it's called Life is Physics. Evolution is a collective phenomenon far from equilibrium. It's a hypothetical paper, so it sort of posits this hypothesis that can we think of evolution as a collective phenomenon, non-equilibrium collective phenomenon. There's a point of view. There's no yes or no answer to this question. This is an open question in some sense. So, but this is what the authors feel. And if you want to get a perspective on in what way or in what sense you can consider evolution as a collective phenomenon, then this is a very nice paper to read. There are lecture notes by Daniel Fisher on evolutionary dynamics, which talks a little bit nitty-gritty of these models, how to write these coupled differential equations that can then model these evolutionary dynamics. There's again a very nice review in Nature Reviews Genetics on these fitness landscapes and how to think of this evolution in the context of these fitness landscapes. There's some very nice papers by Kavita Jain in Bangalore, which again talks of how to think of evolution in the context of these landscapes. There's also this very nice paper on this application of statistical physics, which we've been talking about in this course, how to take these same concepts and to apply it to evolutionary biology. Okay, so this is, I think, a very nice reading list for those of you who are interested in thinking about evolution from a physics point of view. as from a dynamical systems point of view. So yeah, so if you're interested, please look up these papers. All right, so I think I'll stop. All right, so there are a couple of questions. So, all right, I'm asked that if you're interested in doing research in the field of biophysics, can you please give some guidance? Well, it sort of depends. So, can you tell me like what stage of your so have you completed your master's, or like what stage of your career you're in? Um, So, anyway, while you maybe type it out, I can give a general sort of overview, right? So, let me assume that you know you're interested in doing a PhD ultimately in this field. So, one of the ways you can do is that, for example, you look up people starting in India, let us say, you look at people who work in this field of biological physics, right? So let's say all of the IITs have some people. So IIT Bombay, in IIT Bombay, we have a very large group of people who work in biological physics. Every IIT, has its own group. So, for example, IIT Madras has a nice group. IIT Delhi has some people working on this. IIT Kharagpur has some people working on this. The newer IITs have people working on this. ICERs, for the Indian Institute of Science Education and Research, these ICERs have, again, some of these ICERs have nice groups. So, for example, ICER Pune, ICER Mohali, these have large groups working in biophysics. So you can look up who these people are. So just give a Google search, write a name of institute, and write biophysics or theoretical mathematical biology, and see what names turn up. And if any of these people are working in sort of fields that pique your interest, I think mostly people are open. You can just drop them an email and ask if they have any positions. If you I see. So if you have done a PhD, then the next step would possibly be to do a postdoctoral fellowship. So again, if you have so for example, if you're looking for experimental, so depending on whether you're looking for experimental projects or theoretical projects, so the general advice I would give you is that sort of find people, let us say in India, who are doing research that you're interested in, and then write to them. All of us have our web pages. Um, we all of us in our web pages will find our email addresses. So write to the person, for example, who sort of aligned to the field that you are interested in, and see if they have an opening. Even if they, I think we, in general, there is reasonable funding for postdoctoral fellowships, at least in the larger universities and institutes. So, so so depending on what you have done in your PhD and what of those skills you can sort of transfer um, into these topics that you're interested in, uh, I think people would welcome postdoctoral applications. So just write to people informally, and see what they say, and I'm sure you'll get some responses from some people. We are always looking for interested postdocs to work on problems. So if you have a PhD, just identify a suitable advisor and email them, and yeah, hopefully that should work out. Uh, yeah. So in case you want to talk a little bit more in detail, you can drop me an email, and I'm happy to talk to you a little. All right. In network, Rajashekhar asks, in network biology systems, what type of signals are used? Um, that if I understand the question correctly, um, it's a more generic sort of. So let's imagine I have a biological network, right? Um, the more generic way, perhaps, of asking this question, if I understand it correctly, is to say what are what are the interactions between the nodes or the components of this network, right? Uh, and that, of course, depends on uh, the particular network that you're talking about. So, for example, if I think about let's say regulatory networks of proteins, um, then let us say I have protein A and protein B, right? And um, let's say protein A physically goes and interacts with protein B. So often there is some sort of a lock and key mechanism in interacting proteins that, this protein A can come and sit in a sort of hole that fits it structurally into protein B. And once it fits it, maybe that triggers some sort of response in protein B. So maybe it changes its structure, it starts performing some function and so on. So in that sense, this physical interaction could then become a signal to protein B in order to perform whatever function it needs to do. Or for example, if I'm thinking of, let us say, mixed networks. So for example, let us say a protein can go and bind on let us say, a DNA segment. And by binding on the DNA segment, it can sort of activate a gene that produces a different protein. Okay. Or it can repress a gene that was producing some other protein. Uh, Either way. So again, so that interaction of the protein going and binding on the genome then becomes a signal on this network. Or you could think of, for example, more conventional signals in sense of if you think of neural networks, how do neurons transmit information, and there you have neurons that are connected to one another through um, their axons and their ganglia and so on. And there you're passing electrical signals from one neuron to another through these currents that are driven across membrane channels by imbalances of charged ions like sodium and potassium and so on. And for those sort of networks, the signals would actually be electrical signals. You would drive electrical signals from one node, which is one neuron, to another node, which is another neuron. So depending on the network that you are, so biological networks come in different forms and flavors, and depending on the network that you're interested in, you can have different sorts of signals that regulate the functioning of these networks. Okay? So there is no one single answer. But it's a nice question. Thank you for asking it. All right. So I think if there are no further questions, it has been nice. Chatting with you people today, and also the last live interaction session. I hope you got some use out of these courses. I hope it's piqued your sort of interest in this field of biological physics, biology generally, but more specifically mathematical biology and modeling of these biological systems. We are the community, I think, as a whole, and this is an extremely, how should I say, this is an extremely emerging field in some sense, in that as a sort of, let's say, students of physics or mathematics or even engineering, there is a lot of problems in biology that you could tackle using techniques that you learn in these sort of science or engineering courses. So, we have colleagues, for example, sitting in the civil engineering department who study biological systems. We have colleagues in the mechanical engineering department who study biological systems. We have colleagues in the chemical engineering department who study biological systems. So, because biological systems are so complex, there is, regardless of what your background is, whether it's physics or mathematics or whether it's some engineering background, there is always, if you're interested in these systems, if you're interested in asking these questions, that how do cells function, how does life emerge, this very complex system, how can I break it down into simpler components and start to think about them from a very quantitative point of view. There is always scope for doing extremely high quality research in these sort of questions, in these sort of areas. So in that sense, biological physics is a very emergent area. It's still relatively new, and therefore still there is a lot of scope of research to be done. Um, so yeah, for those of you who are interested, please see who works on in these fields, and contact people. I'm sure people will be happy to reply and guide you. All right. Okay. Thank you. Best of luck. Uh, whatever you choose to do in life. And yeah. Bye. Thank you.